In the quiet dawn of ancient history, beside the winding waters of the Tiber River, there stood no monuments, no marble palaces, no armies ready to march. There was only a small collection of huts, humble, thatched, nestled into the soft green hills of central Italy. This modest beginning would, over centuries, swell into one of the most powerful and enduring empires the world has ever known: Rome. Rome did not emerge overnight. It rose slowly, shaped not just by conquest or coin, but by stories, laws, customs, and the human desire to belong to something greater than oneself. The tale of Rome is one of extraordinary transformation. From that early village on the Tiber to a sprawling dominion that stretched from the highlands of Scotland to the deserts of Egypt, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Persian Gulf. It is a story woven with ambition, ingenuity, betrayal, glory, and decline, and above all, endurance. This journey through Roman history invites you to rest beside the firelight of time and trace the outlines of an empire that, even in ruin, shaped the very world we live in. For though Rome has long since fallen, its heartbeat still echoes in the architecture of our cities, the languages we speak, the laws that govern us, and the philosophies we ponder. It is there in our calendars, in the roads beneath our feet, in the republics and senates of modern nations. Rome is no longer a place, it is a legacy. We will begin by walking through Rome's early myths, tales of twins raised by a she-wolf, of kings and heroes, of civil struggle and sacred oaths. These stories, mythic as they are, offer more than simple entertainment. They speak of how people wanted to remember themselves, not as conquerors first, but as survivors and thinkers, as warriors who also believed in order, law, and tradition. As we move through the age of kings to the founding of the Republic, we'll see a people struggling to balance liberty and authority, to build a society where citizen and state were intertwined. The Republic would become the crucible for Roman ideals, discipline, duty, debate, and expansion. It was a time of great orators, bold generals, and shifting alliances, a political experiment both fragile and fierce. But as the Republic grew, so too did its burdens. With wealth and territory came inequality, unrest, and eventually civil war. Out of this chaos would emerge emperors, some brilliant, others brutal, who would steer Rome through triumphs and catastrophes alike. From Augustus to Constantine, each ruler added to the architecture of empire, building cities, spreading ideas, defining borders, and shaping identities. We will explore Rome's cultural achievements, its engineering marvels, its legal systems, its art and religion. These were not just adornments of empire, they were tools of governance, persuasion, and memory. Aqueducts and amphitheatres were as much symbols of Rome's greatness as were its armies. The Pax Romana, or Roman peace, was not merely the absence of war, it was a vision of unity, however uneven, across lands once divided. But no empire is eternal, and so we will follow Rome into its later centuries, as internal weaknesses grew and external pressures mounted. The city that once ruled the world would be sacked, its institutions strained, its territories fractured. Yet even in collapse, Rome adapted. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine world, would carry forward the Roman name and spirit for nearly 1,000 more years. And in the West, medieval Europe would rise upon the stones and laws of Rome. Throughout this script, we will gently guide you through each chapter of Rome's rise and fall, not as a dry list of dates or battles, but as a flowing narrative shaped by people and choices, by dreams and failures. You will meet visionaries and tyrants, builders and destroyers, thinkers and soldiers. Each left their mark not only on stone, but on history itself. From the founding myths of Romulus and Remus to the legal reforms of Justinian, from the Senate's debates to the shadow of the Colosseum at dusk, we will move through time with care and curiosity. This is not only the story of an empire, it is the story of how humans have imagined power, struggled with freedom, defined civilization, and left echoes for future generations to hear. So, as you settle in, let the story of Rome unfold slowly before you. Let the names become familiar, the places vivid, the history alive. For in understanding Rome, we come a little closer to understanding ourselves. And in tracing the arc of its rise and decline, we are reminded that all things built by humans carry within them the seeds of brilliance and of change. And now, our journey begins. Long before marble temples lined the Capitoline Hill, and before legions marched under the eagle of Rome, there were stories told in whispers and song, passed from generation to generation like sacred embers. These were the myths that gave Rome its soul, long before it had an empire. And at the very heart of those tales stood two brothers, a wolf and a city destined for greatness. The Romans, ever fond of order and symbolism, did not begin their history with mere happenstance. Instead, they looked back to a lineage that stretched across time and sea, all the way to the ashes of another great city, Troy. According to legend, as flames engulfed Troy at the close of the Trojan War, one man among the ruins stood out not for his sword, but for his sense of duty. This man was Aeneas, the son of the goddess Venus and the mortal Anchises. He carried on his back his aging father and led his young son by the hand, leaving behind the wreckage of Troy to seek a new home. Virgil's Aeneid, composed centuries later during the reign of Augustus, would immortalize this journey. Aeneas, guided by divine prophecy and personal resolve, wandered across the Mediterranean, facing storms and sorrows, love and loss, most famously with Queen Dido of Carthage, until he finally arrived on the shores of Latium in central Italy. There, after conflict and alliance with local tribes, Aeneas laid the foundations not of Rome itself, but of a lineage that would someday produce its founders. His descendants became kings of Alba Longa, a city in the Latin hills, and generations passed. It was from this royal bloodline that the twins Romulus and Remus were born. Their mother, Rhea Silvia, was a Vestal virgin and daughter of Numitor, a rightful king overthrown by his brother Amulius. To prevent any future claims to the throne, Amulius had Rhea imprisoned and ordered her twin sons to be drowned in the Tiber. But fate, the Romans believed, cannot be so easily undone. The basket carrying the infants drifted down the river until it caught in the roots of a fig tree near the Palatine Hill. There, in the wild, they were discovered by an unlikely savior, a she-wolf. In the silence of the forest, under the eyes of the gods, this wolf nursed the children with the same care she might have given her own cubs. A nearby shepherd, Faustulus, eventually found them and took them into his home, where he and his wife raised the boys as their own. As Romulus and Remus grew, so too did their strength and sense of justice. Upon learning of their true heritage, they overthrew Amulius and restored their grandfather Numitor to the throne of Alba Longa. But the twins sought more than to rule a city already made. They dreamed of founding one anew, near the very riverbank where their lives had been spared. Yet even this dream divine as it seemed, was not free from human conflict. Disagreement arose over where the city should stand and who should rule it. Romulus favored the Palatine hill, Remus the Aventine. They turned to augury, the reading of omens in the flight of birds, to settle the matter. Romulus claimed victory, but Remus mocked the signs and his brothers knew walls. In a fit of rage, Romulus struck down Remus, sealing both the birth of the city and the first fratricide in Roman myth. "So perish all who defy the walls of Rome," Romulus is said to have declared. And so the city was named after him, Rome, founded on blood and destiny, shaped by divine lineage and mortal will. Romulus would go on to rule as the city's first king, and the she-wolf that nursed him and his brother would become one of Rome's most enduring symbols, an emblem not just of survival, but of protection, wildness, and the sacred bond between nature and fate. In this mythical tale, we find echoes of themes that will thread throughout Roman history: the tension between kinship and conflict, the weight of legacy, the belief in divine purpose, and the idea that Rome was not merely built, it was chosen. These stories were not treated as mere fables. They were part of the Roman psyche, reminders that Rome's greatness came not from convenience, but from struggle, sacrifice, and an origin wrapped in the hands of gods and wolves alike. And in the quiet hours of Rome's future centuries, emperors and citizens alike would still look back to this moment: the cradle in the reeds, the wolf in the cave, and the first stones laid by a brother with blood on his hands and destiny in his heart. The moment Romulus raised his hand against his twin brother, the story of Rome entered its tragic maturity. It was not just the act of fratricide that stunned Roman imagination, it was its symbolic weight. Two brothers, born of divine blood and suckled by the same she-wolf, were meant to rule together. But the vision of shared power was not to be. In killing Remus, Romulus sealed the fate of the city he would found, one forged by ambition, tested by conflict, and sustained by sacrifice. That a city destined to rule the world began with a brother's death was no accident in Roman thought. It was destiny, fated and foretold, both sorrowful and necessary. Romulus, now alone, established the city on the Palatine hill. According to tradition, this took place in 753 BCE, a date later Romans would treat as sacred, marking the beginning of the Roman calendar. Romulus gathered shepherds, wanderers, and fugitives to populate his new city, creating a rough community of men. Yet Rome needed more than bodies, it needed bonds. So Romulus orchestrated one of the earliest and most infamous Roman legends, the rape of the Sabine women. Having invited the neighboring Sabines to a festival, Romulus and his men seized their women, sparking outrage and a war. But in a striking twist, the conflict was not ended by swords, but by the women themselves. Having grown attached to their Roman husbands and now bearing their children, the Sabine women interceded, stepping between the fighting men and demanding peace. A treaty was forged, and the two peoples were united. Through this tale, Romans saw a deeper truth, that the city's strength came not from conquest alone, but from assimilation, alliance, and, however mythically portrayed, the merging of old and new bloodlines. Romulus ruled as king until his mysterious disappearance. Some said he was taken up by the gods in a storm and transformed into the deity Quirinus. Others whispered of betrayal and murder by the Senate. Either way, his departure marked the end of the first chapter of Roman monarchy, and the beginning of a complex, semi-mythical succession of kings. Following Romulus came Numa Pompilius, a Sabine by origin and known as a wise and peaceful ruler. Where Romulus had built with fire and iron, Numa built with rituals and laws. He is credited with founding many of Rome's religious institutions, including the Vestal Virgins, the office of the Pontifex Maximus, and the sacred calendar. Under his rule, Rome turned inward, shaping not just its streets, but its soul. It was Numa who instilled in Romans the idea that civic order and divine favor were intertwined. Next came Tullus Hostilius, a king of war rather than wisdom. He reignited Rome's aggressive spirit, famously clashing with the neighboring city of Alba Longa. According to legend, the conflict was resolved not by armies, but by champions. 3 Roman brothers, the Horatii, and 3 Alban brothers, the Curiati. In the end, Rome prevailed, but Tullus's reign was marked by growing tensions and a fiery end. He was said to have been struck down by Jupiter's lightning for neglecting proper religious rites. Then came Ancus Marcius, a grandson of Numa, who balanced piety and pragmatism. He expanded Rome's territory and established the port of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber, planting seeds for Rome's later commercial power. Ancus built bridges, walls and aqueducts, turning the fledgling city into something more permanent. His rule marked a transition from myths to memory, from legend to early history. The last 3 kings, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus, each left indelible marks on Rome's political structure and social fabric. Tarquinius Priscus, of Etruscan origin, introduced grand architectural projects, including the beginnings of the Circus Maximus. His successor, Servius Tullius, was a reformer who restructured Roman society into classes based on wealth and military capacity, laying the groundwork for the later republic. But it was the final king, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, whose tyranny would lead to monarchy's downfall. His rule was marked by arrogance, cruelty, and disregard for traditional rites. The final spark came when his son, Sextus Tarquinius, assaulted Lucretia, a noble Roman woman. Her suicide and the outrage it provoked led to an uprising led by Lucius Junius Brutus. The monarchy was overthrown, and in its place rose the Roman Republic, a new chapter born not of legend but of political will. And so the early kings of Rome passed into memory, their deeds half shrouded in myth, half rooted in what may have been true. To the Romans, this blend of fact and fable mattered less than the moral force these stories carried. From the she-wolf to the last Tarquin, these tales taught Rome who it was, a city that rose from fratricide and faith, from divine whispers and human struggle. A city that believed its destiny was written not just in the stars, but in the choices of its kings, its rebels, and above all, its people. The transition from monarchy to republic in Rome was not merely a change of rulers, but a foundational reimagining of political identity, one shaped by trauma, resistance, and the deep yearning for shared power. At the center of this shift stands a single harrowing moment, the fall of Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome. Tarquin the Proud was not a ruler of gentle reputation. His reign, lasting from around 535 to 509 BCE, was marked by growing tyranny and disregard for the traditional advisory body, the Senate. Unlike earlier kings who, even in legend, were shown to have engaged with Roman customs and religion, Tarquin ruled with an iron will, bypassing established norms and consolidating power in the royal household. The Superbus in his name, did not reflect admiration. It meant proud in the pejorative sense, arrogant, overbearing, despotic. According to tradition, Tarquin had risen to the throne through violence. He allegedly orchestrated the assassination of his predecessor, Servius Tullius, throwing him down the steps of the Senate and allowing his body to lie unburied in the street. From the outset, then, his kingship was stained with blood. Under Tarquin's rule, Rome saw the expansion of monumental building projects, including the completion of the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. But grandeur, in this case, could not mask the underlying discontent brewing among Rome's aristocratic families. The event that finally shattered the monarchy came not through warfare or economic collapse, but through a personal tragedy that stirred the very soul of the Roman people. Sextus Tarquinius, the king's son, assaulted Lucretia, a noblewoman famed for her virtue and loyalty. The tale, preserved most famously by the historian Livy, describes how Lucretia summoned her husband and father after the assault, and in their presence took her own life to preserve her honor. Her act became a rallying cry. Lucius Junius Brutus, a relative of the royal family but long underestimated as a quiet, passive figure, stepped into leadership. Swearing on Lucretia's blood, he vowed that Rome would never again be ruled by a king. Brutus, along with other noble leaders, stirred the people and expelled the Tarquin family from the city. The monarchy was declared over in 509 BCE, and in its place arose a new form of governance, the Roman Republic. The founding of the Republic was a dramatic pivot. Rather than concentrating authority in a single ruler, power was distributed among elected officials and collective bodies. At the top of this new hierarchy stood two consuls, elected annually and serving together to ensure that no one man could dominate the state. The Senate, an advisory body during the monarchy, gained new weight, becoming the core institution guiding Rome's foreign policy, financial management, and military decisions. This dual consul system was revolutionary. While imperfect in practice, the intent was clear. Checks and balances would guard against tyranny. The Roman fear of monarchy remained deeply ingrained, influencing everything from political customs to vocabulary. Even centuries later, the term rex, king, would carry suspicion, and ambitious leaders would need to cloak their authority in republican forms, even when wielding absolute power. The early republic was fragile, yet it held firm, largely because it drew strength from the collective trauma of Tarquin's tyranny. Rome's noble families, or patricians, filled the new offices and forged a political culture based on duty, civic participation, and an idealized sense of shared governance. But even at this stage, fault lines were visible, most notably between the patricians and the plebeians, or common people. The Republic, while outwardly a system of freedom, remained an elite-driven institution. The plebeians had little access to real power, and their growing frustration would soon lead to the first great internal struggles of the Republic. Still, the symbolic birth of the Republic in 509 BCE was more than a political event. It became a cornerstone of Roman identity. The Republic stood as a bulwark against tyranny, an affirmation that Rome belonged to its citizens rather than a crown. Festivals such as the Regifugium, or Flight of the Kings, commemorated the expulsion of Tarquin and served as annual reminders of the Republic's precious origins. As Rome grew in power and territory, this founding myth would be retold across centuries. It was a story that mixed legend with law, ethics with memory. The death of monarchy was not merely a historical fact, it was a cultural principle. And though the Republic would face many challenges in the centuries ahead, from internal corruption to civil war, it would always look back to the year 509 BCE as a sacred point of origin. In the quiet halls of the Forum, as magistrates passed judgment and orators addressed the people, one could feel the echo of that early oath. Brutus's promise on Lucretia's grave, and the eternal vow that no king would ever again wear the crown of Rome. The Republic had been born, not in peace, but in defiance, and with it a new chapter in the city's long journey had begun. As the Roman monarchy came to an end and the Republic rose in its place, the city's leadership evolved into a complex system that sought to balance authority and prevent tyranny. At the heart of this new system were two annually elected consuls, magistrates who shared power equally and could veto each other's decisions. These consuls led Rome's armies, convened the Senate, and oversaw the state's legal and religious affairs. In times of crisis, one might be granted temporary dictatorial powers, but even this was limited to 6 months. The idea was clear: Rome would never again bow to the will of a single sovereign. The Senate, originally an advisory council under the monarchy, expanded in influence under the Republic. Though unelected and composed largely of patricians, members of the aristocratic families, it became the Republic's most enduring and powerful institution. The Senate directed foreign policy, controlled finances, supervised religious rites, and advised the consuls. Its authority, though informal at first, grew steadily through tradition and precedent. Roman senators, draped in their distinctive togas with purple stripes, became the guardians of republican values, stewards of the state's past, and strategists of its future. Beneath this elite-driven framework, however, lay a growing social tension. While the Republic claimed to represent the res publica, the public affair or common good, it was in reality an oligarchy. The patricians monopolized the top offices, priesthoods, and senate seats. Their birth, not their merit, secured their role in governance. The commoners of Rome, known as plebeians, were excluded from real power, and their frustration gradually crystallized into political struggle. These tensions erupted into what historians now call the conflict of the orders, a long series of non-violent social protests and reforms that spanned nearly 2 centuries, beginning soon after the Republic's founding. The plebeians, who formed the backbone of Rome's army and labor force, realized that without their support, the Republic could not function. They withdrew en masse from the city several times in what were called secessions, refusing to serve in the military or participate in civic life until their grievances were addressed. In response, gradual concessions were made. The most significant early development was the creation of the tribunes of the plebs. These officials, elected exclusively by plebeians, had the power to veto decisions by magistrates and the Senate that they deemed harmful to the common people. Their bodies were declared sacrosanct, meaning any violence against them was a capital offense. This was a powerful check on patrician authority. Another major step was the codification of Roman law in the 12 Tables around 450 BCE. Previously, laws had been unwritten and interpreted at the discretion of patrician judges. The 12 tables, displayed publicly in the Forum, offered a more transparent legal structure. Though still biased toward patrician interests, the act of writing down the law was a momentous step in Rome's legal development. It laid the groundwork for Roman jurisprudence that would echo for millennia. As time passed, plebeians secured the right to hold higher offices. By the 4th century BCE, laws were passed allowing plebeians to be elected as consuls, though in practice such cases remained rare for a while. Further victories included the right to marry patricians, the opening of key religious posts, and eventually formal recognition of the plebiscita, resolutions passed by the plebeian council, as binding laws for all citizens, not just plebeians. Still, this slow democratization was always intertwined with the complex web of Roman class, family prestige, and tradition. Even as plebeians gained access to higher offices, a new elite emerged, the nobiles, or noble class, which included both patricians and wealthy plebeians. These families dominated the Senate and continued to shape Rome's political direction, albeit with a broader base. Despite its internal divisions, this early republic structure proved remarkably resilient. Its principles, checks on authority, civic duty, and legal transparency, helped Rome expand not only territorially, but ideologically. Roman citizens, even those far from the city centre, began to identify with the Republic as a shared enterprise. The right to vote in assemblies, the prospect of upward mobility, and the symbols of Roman citizenship carried immense social and cultural power. At the same time, the Republic's fragility was always present. Factionalism, ambition, and inequality simmered beneath its surface. The divide between optimates, aristocratic conservatives, and populares, those seeking reform through popular support, had early seeds in these struggles. The plebeians' hard-won rights, though momentous, had to be constantly defended in a system where tradition often spoke louder than law. Thus, the early Roman Republic was born not in harmony, but in compromise. It was a republic forged through protest, reform, and political innovation. As we drift deeper into the story of Rome, we will see how these foundations, while imperfect, allowed the Republic to survive for centuries and laid the groundwork for an empire that would shape the world. As Rome grew in power, it eventually collided with another rising force on the Mediterranean stage, Carthage. Located in what is now Tunisia, Carthage was a wealthy maritime empire founded by Phoenician settlers centuries earlier. By the 3rd century BCE, it had become a dominant commercial power, controlling vast trade routes, outposts, and coastal cities stretching from North Africa to Spain and Sicily. The Punic Wars, named after the Latin word Punicus, referring to the Carthaginians' Phoenician roots, would span more than a century and define the destiny of the Western Mediterranean. The First Punic War began in 264 BCE. At its heart was a dispute over the control of Sicily, a strategically positioned and fertile island coveted by both Rome and Carthage. What began as a localized conflict quickly escalated into a full-scale war that lasted 23 years, the longest naval war in ancient history. Rome, which had little naval experience at the time, rapidly built a fleet and trained crews, using captured Carthaginian ships as models. In an innovative move, they fitted their vessels with boarding devices called corvi, allowing Roman soldiers to turn sea battles into something closer to infantry skirmishes. Despite early setbacks, Rome's perseverance paid off. After years of grueling battles at sea and on land, including engagements near Sicily and North Africa, Carthage was forced to sue for peace in 241 BCE. Under the terms of the treaty, Carthage ceded Sicily, the first Roman province outside the Italian peninsula, and paid a heavy indemnity. It was a momentous step. Rome had proven itself as more than a land-based power. It now looked outward, with naval ambitions and a hunger for dominance. But the peace would not last. The Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BCE, is perhaps the most famous of the three, largely due to one man, Hannibal Barca. A brilliant Carthaginian general, Hannibal was the son of Hamilcar Barca, a hero of the First Punic War who had instilled in his son a lifelong hatred of Rome. When Hannibal seized the city of Saguntum in Spain, a Roman ally, Rome declared war. What followed was one of the most audacious military campaigns in ancient history. Rather than approach Rome by sea, Hannibal marched his army across the Pyrenees, through Gaul, modern France, and over the snow-covered Alps. It was a treacherous route few had dared, let alone with an army. Yet Hannibal succeeded. With tens of thousands of soldiers, cavalry, and a now legendary group of war elephants, he descended into northern Italy in 218 BCE. Though many of his elephants died during the crossing, the feat alone stunned the Roman world. Once in Italy, Hannibal unleashed a string of brilliant victories. At the Battle of Trebia, he lured the Romans into a trap. At Lake Trasimene, he orchestrated one of the largest ambushes in military history. But it was the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE that would leave the deepest scar. There, Hannibal encircled a much larger Roman force and annihilated it. Perhaps as many as 50,000 Roman soldiers died in a single day. It was a crushing, demoralizing loss. Roman streets fell silent and panic gripped the city. And yet Rome did not fall. The Republic showed a resilience that would come to define it. Instead of surrendering, Rome adopted a strategy of attrition under the cautious general Fabius Maximus, nicknamed Cunctator, the Delayer. Rather than confront Hannibal directly, Fabius harassed his supply lines and avoided open battle. Meanwhile, Rome extended its reach into Spain and targeted Carthaginian allies, slowly weakening Hannibal's position in Italy. After years of war, Rome found its answer in the brilliant young general Scipio Africanus. In 202 BCE, Scipio took the fight to Carthage's doorstep and defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, effectively ending the Second Punic War. Carthage survived, but barely. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BCE, was less about strategy and more about finality. Despite its reduced status, Carthage had begun to recover economically, which alarmed some Roman senators, particularly Cato the Elder. According to tradition, Cato ended every speech with the phrase, "Carthago delenda est." Carthage must be destroyed. Eventually, Rome found a pretext to strike. The war was swift and brutal. After a lengthy siege, Roman forces breached the city's walls, razed it to the ground, and enslaved the survivors. According to legend, the Romans salted the earth to ensure nothing would grow, though this may be more metaphor than fact. The Punic Wars were transformative. They marked Rome's emergence as the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean, but they also changed the Republic internally. The wars brought great wealth to Rome, but also widened the gap between the rich and the poor. Veteran soldiers returned to find their farms in ruins, while wealthy elites consolidated land and slaves. A new chapter was beginning, one of expansion, but also internal strain. The legacy of these wars endures. They are remembered not just for their battles, but for the human drama, especially Hannibal's crossing of the Alps, a feat so daring and visionary that it continues to inspire military tacticians, historians, and storytellers alike. And in Rome, the memory of the Punic Wars lived on as a symbol of what it meant to persevere, to lose, to rebuild, and to rise stronger. As the Second Punic War entered its final stages, Rome found hope in a young, ambitious commander, Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was the son of a fallen general, but by the age of 24, he had already captured the imagination of the Roman people. Scipio had been watching Hannibal's long and devastating campaign in Italy, and rather than meet him head-on, he conceived a different strategy: take the fight to Carthage's heart in North Africa. It was a daring and bold move, one that required not only military genius, but also the ability to rally support from a war-weary Senate. In 204 BCE, Scipio landed in North Africa with an army and began disrupting Carthage's alliances. He won over local kings, including the Numidian prince Massinissa, whose cavalry would later play a decisive role in the war. As the pressure mounted, Carthage recalled Hannibal from Italy, bringing him back to defend his homeland. For the first time, the two great tacticians would meet face-to-face on a battlefield, Zama, in 202 BCE. The Battle of Zama marked a pivotal moment in ancient history. Unlike the battles Hannibal had fought in Italy, the terrain of Zama offered little opportunity for ambush. Scipio, having studied Hannibal's tactics carefully, developed a flexible and disciplined formation. He allowed the war elephants to charge through open lanes between his troops, where they could be isolated and neutralized. When Hannibal's front lines faltered, Scipio launched a devastating counterattack, with Massinissa's cavalry striking from the rear. The Roman victory at Zama was total. Hannibal survived, but his army was broken. Carthage sued for peace once more, and this time the terms were even harsher. Carthage was forced to surrender its fleet, pay another crippling indemnity, and was forbidden from waging war without Roman approval. Scipio returned to Rome in triumph and was awarded the honorific title Africanus for his conquest. But even in defeat, Carthage endured. For decades after Zama, Carthage abided by the treaty's restrictions and slowly rebuilt its economy. Though stripped of its military power, it became a thriving commercial hub again. Yet this resurgence unsettled Rome. Prominent Roman voices, particularly that of Cato the Elder, continued to demand Carthage's destruction. Cato's warnings, always ending with Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, were not merely rhetorical flourishes. They reflected a genuine fear that Carthage might someday rise again. In 149 BCE, that fear was used as justification for the Third Punic War. Carthage, having defended itself without Roman consent against a neighboring Numidian incursion, was accused of violating the peace terms. Rome seized this moment to strike. What followed was not a war of evenly matched armies, but a relentless siege and eventual annihilation. The siege of Carthage lasted for 3 years. Despite being outmatched, the Carthaginians fought with tenacity, reinforcing their walls and resisting through starvation and fire. But by 146 BCE, the Roman legions broke through. They razed the city street by street. According to some accounts, the destruction was so thorough that Roman soldiers wept at the scale of devastation they were causing. Carthage's fate was sealed. The survivors were sold into slavery. The city was flattened, its buildings leveled, and its harbour filled with rubble. Whether the Romans actually salted the earth is debated by historians, but the symbolism of total destruction was unmistakable. Carthage, once a proud and prosperous rival, had been erased. With Carthage gone, Rome emerged as the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. The balance of power had shifted. No longer simply a regional Italian force, Rome now governed provinces across Sicily, Spain, and North Africa. This marked the dawn of Rome's imperial age, an era of vast expansion, administration, and cultural integration. But the victories of the Punic Wars came at a price. The long years of warfare transformed Rome internally. The influx of slaves and wealth from conquered lands widened social divisions. Many small farmers who had fought in the wars returned to find their lands sold or in ruin, unable to compete with the wealthy aristocrats who bought up farmland and used slave labor. The fabric of the Republic began to strain under this growing inequality. Political tensions simmered, populist leaders emerged, and civil unrest began to spread. Still, in the grand sweep of history, the Punic Wars marked the crucible in which the Roman Empire was forged. From the daring of Hannibal to the resolve of Scipio and the final destruction of Carthage, this was a saga of ambition, strategy, pride, and perseverance. The echoes of this conflict would reverberate through Rome's future and through all empires that followed. It was not just a contest of armies, it was a collision of civilizations, and from its ashes, the Roman Republic stood poised to dominate the world. As the dust settled from the Punic Wars and the once mighty Carthage lay in ruins, Rome stood at the threshold of a new era. The Republic was no longer merely an Italian power. It was now an imperial force with ambitions stretching far beyond the Western Mediterranean. In the decades that followed the defeat of Carthage, Roman legions marched across seas and over mountains, carving their name into lands rich in history, culture, and resistance. The Eastern Mediterranean, long dominated by the fragmented remnants of Alexander the Great's empire, was next to feel the weight of Roman ambition. The Greek world, once a bastion of philosophy, art, and political thought, was now fractured into kingdoms vying for power. Rome, first invited as an ally in these conflicts, soon found opportunities for intervention too tempting to resist. One by one, the Hellenistic states, Macedonia, the Seleucid Empire, and finally Egypt, were drawn into Rome's orbit through war, diplomacy, and treaties that increasingly favored Roman supremacy. By 146 BCE, the same year Carthage was destroyed, Rome crushed the city of Corinth in Greece. The once thriving cultural hub was looted and burned as a warning to others. The message was clear: resistance to Roman authority came at a high price. In the following years, entire Greek territories were absorbed into Roman provinces. The rich heritage of Hellenistic civilization, its art, architecture, philosophy, and language, was not destroyed, but rather appropriated. Roman elites studied Greek texts, sculpted statues in Greek style, and even sent their sons to be educated in Athens. Rome, the conqueror, became a student of the conquered. This expansion eastward brought not only culture, but also immense wealth. Tribute poured into the Republic's coffers from new provinces. Generals returned from campaigns with spoils of war, gold, artworks, and perhaps most notably, slaves. The Roman appetite for conquest became increasingly tied to its economy and to the growing disparities within its own society. The influx of enslaved people fundamentally reshaped the Roman economy. Vast estates known as latifundia emerged across the Italian countryside. These were large agricultural estates, worked almost entirely by slave labor. Wealthy patricians, many of whom were senators or former consuls, bought up smaller farms from citizens who had either perished in war or returned too impoverished to continue. As a result, a new class of rural elite emerged, growing richer with each new conquest. But this prosperity came with a dark shadow. The more slaves Rome acquired, the more its economy began to depend on their labor. Slavery in Rome was not defined by race, but by conquest. Whole populations were uprooted, sold, and scattered across the empire. In some regions, slaves outnumbered free citizens, creating an undercurrent of tension and fear. Slave revolts, though often quickly crushed, became more frequent and more violent. The seeds of future instability had been sown. Meanwhile, in the urban heart of Rome, the common people, once the backbone of the Republic's army, found themselves increasingly sidelined. Displaced from their farms and unable to compete with slave-powered agriculture, many migrated to the city in search of work. But jobs were scarce and poverty widespread. A growing number of Romans became reliant on grain handouts and public entertainment to survive. The Senate, wary of unrest but unwilling to enact deep reforms, offered only temporary relief. This widening economic gap strained the political structures of the Republic. The Senate, still dominated by aristocratic families, clung tightly to power. They viewed the grievances of the lower classes as threats to be managed, not addressed. Meanwhile, reformers, often from noble families themselves, began to speak out. They warned that Rome's social fabric was fraying, that the concentration of land and wealth in the hands of the few would lead to ruin. The Republic, once lauded for its balance of powers and civic virtue, was becoming brittle. Its political institutions, crafted for a small city-state, now groaned under the weight of empire. Corruption increased. Ambitious generals sought personal glory and influence beyond what the Senate deemed acceptable. And while Rome's legions brought peace to distant lands, the streets of the capital became restless. In this chapter of Rome's history, we see not just the triumphs of conquest, but also the beginning of a quiet unraveling. The empire was expanding rapidly, absorbing cultures and wealth at a staggering pace, but its foundations were shifting. The ideals of shared civic duty and republican virtue were slowly being replaced by inequality, ambition, and unrest. Rome, it seemed, was stretching not only its borders, but the very limits of what its republic could endure. In the late 2nd century BCE, the growing unrest within the Roman Republic began to coalesce into political action. At the center of this turbulent moment stood two brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. Born into an elite family, yet deeply disturbed by the widening gap between Rome's aristocracy and its struggling citizenry, the Gracchi became unlikely champions of reform. Their legacy would set in motion a chain of conflicts that slowly fractured the old republican order and revealed just how thinly stretched Rome's institutions had become. Tiberius Gracchus, the elder brother, came to prominence in a Rome marked by wealth and injustice. The vast latifundia, controlled by a handful of aristocratic families, had driven countless small farmers from their land. Veterans returned from Rome's distant wars to find their plots bought up or left in ruin, with little support awaiting them. The once proud yeoman class that had formed the Republic's military backbone was vanishing, replaced by dependent urban poor and displaced rural families. When Tiberius was elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BCE, he proposed a land reform bill that aimed to redistribute public land ager publicus to landless citizens. It was, in many ways, a modest proposal, rooted in an old law that had simply fallen into disuse. But to the senatorial elite, it was a threat. They saw the bill as an attack on their property and power, and worse still, Tiberius bypassed the Senate entirely by putting the proposal directly to the popular assembly. The Senate retaliated not through debate, but through violence. When Tiberius sought re-election, a rare and provocative move, senators and their supporters stormed the assembly. Tiberius and many of his followers were beaten to death with wooden benches and clubs. It was the first time in the Republic's history that political violence had spilled so brutally into the streets of Rome. A boundary had been crossed, and the pattern of suppressing reform with force was established. A decade later, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, took up the mantle. Elected tribune in 123 BCE, Gaius brought a broader and more radical agenda. He proposed grain subsidies for the poor, new colonies to relieve overcrowding in the city, and further land reforms. Importantly, he also tried to weaken senatorial dominance by empowering the equestrian class, the wealthy but non-aristocratic order, to serve in juries and tax farming. But once again, fear and resentment festered among the elite. Gaius's reforms gained traction with the people but alienated powerful senators. In 121 BCE, when tensions flared again, the Senate issued the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a final decree granting consuls emergency powers to protect the state. Gaius, knowing what was to come, took his own life during the ensuing violence. More than 3,000 of his supporters were executed without trial. The deaths of the Gracchi marked a turning point. No longer could Rome resolve its internal tensions through peaceful politics alone. The precedent of using state-sanctioned violence against reformers had been set, and the Republic's moral center had begun to fracture. Though the brothers failed to secure lasting reform, their martyrdom left an enduring mark on Roman consciousness. In the years that followed, their names became rallying cries for those who sought justice, and targets for those who feared change. Beneath the surface of these violent episodes lay a deeper rot, the ever-widening gap between the rich and the poor. The influx of wealth from Rome's conquests had concentrated in the hands of a few. Senators and equestrians bought up land, slaves, and influence. They adorned their homes with Greek statues and dined on luxuries imported from across the empire. Their wealth extended not just to possessions, but to power. The Senate increasingly operated as an oligarchy, more concerned with preserving privilege than representing the people. Meanwhile, the urban poor, crowded into Rome's growing slums, struggled to survive. Many were unemployed, as slave labor dominated agriculture and trades. To placate them, politicians began offering grain doles and public games, what later generations would call panem et circenses, bread and circuses. These were not solutions, but distractions, temporary measures that soothed unrest without addressing root causes. Rome was changing. It had become an empire in all but name, yet its governance remained rooted in institutions built for a city-state. the Senate could not or would not adapt. It resisted reform, feared the loss of control, and relied increasingly on manipulation, obstruction, and violence to maintain order. The tribal assemblies, once vital arenas for popular participation, grew stagnant and corrupt, and the voice of the common citizen was often drowned by factionalism and elite maneuvering. The result was a republic that grew increasingly unstable. Political life became polarized, with reformers on one end and conservative hardliners on the other. Trust in the Senate eroded. Ambitious leaders began to see personal armies, not laws or elections, as the surest path to influence. And through it all, the divide between the populares, those who claimed to speak for the people, and the optimates, the defenders of aristocratic rule, deepened into a chasm. Rome's expansion had brought glory, but also inequality. Its conquests enriched a few, but impoverished many. And as the Republic struggled to contain its contradictions, a storm began to gather on the horizon, one that would bring civil wars, dictators, and ultimately the fall of the Republic itself. But before that reckoning came, a series of powerful figures would rise, each shaped by the turmoil and ambition of their age. The story of Rome was far from over. It was entering its most dramatic act. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, the Roman Republic, proud, powerful, and deeply fractured, was already beginning to buckle under the strain of its own success. Political violence, wealth inequality, and the erosion of republican norms had laid the groundwork for extraordinary individuals to rise, not just as politicians, but as warlords. The Republic's institutions still functioned in name, but behind closed doors, power was shifting. It was in this fragile context that three ambitious men, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and Gaius Julius Caesar, formed a private alliance that would reshape Rome forever, the First Triumvirate. Though never formalized by law or ratified by the Senate, the First Triumvirate, forged around 60 BCE, was a political pact of mutual convenience. Each man brought something critical to the table. Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, had the financial clout to fund armies and public works. Pompey, a celebrated general and former consul, had conquered much of the eastern Mediterranean and returned with prestige, troops, and loyal veterans. Caesar, a rising political star with debts but boundless ambition, sought to bolster his influence and gain a powerful provincial command. Together, they bypassed the Senate's resistance and secured mutual gains. Caesar was elected consul in 59 BCE, and in return for supporting Pompey's demands for land grants to his soldiers and Crassus's financial interests, Caesar was awarded the governorship of Gaul for 5 years. It was an assignment that would launch him not just into military glory, but into the heart of Rome's political crisis. Gaul, modern-day France and parts of Belgium, Germany, and Switzerland, was not yet fully under Roman control. Caesar's task was to govern and defend Rome's northern provinces, but he quickly turned this position into a springboard for conquest. Between 58 and 50 BCE, Julius Caesar waged a brilliant and brutal campaign, later chronicled in his own words in Commentari de Bello Gallico, the commentaries on the Gallic War. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul were nothing short of monumental. He defeated several powerful tribal coalitions, subdued vast territories, and crossed into lands few Romans had ever seen. Among his most famous victories was the Siege of Alesia in 52 BCE, where Caesar encircled and captured the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix in a feat of engineering and tactical genius. His victories expanded Roman territory dramatically and brought immense wealth to the Republic and to Caesar personally. But the conquests in Gaul were not just about land or gold. They cemented Caesar's reputation as one of Rome's greatest generals. More dangerously for the Republic's fragile balance of power, they also won him the undying loyalty of battle-hardened legions. These were men who had fought with him, marched with him, and grown wealthy under his command. To them, Caesar was not just a senator or consul. He was a leader who had shared their hardships, who rewarded bravery, and who inspired loyalty through action. As Caesar's fame rose, tensions among the triumvirs deepened. Crassus, seeking his own military glory, embarked on a campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east, but was killed at the disastrous Battle of Carthage in 53 BCE. His death unraveled the delicate alliance, removing the only man who had balanced the power between Caesar and Pompey. With Crassus gone, Pompey grew increasingly uneasy about Caesar's rising influence. The Senate, now dominated by Pompey's allies, began to turn against Caesar. Fearing his ambition and the threat posed by his loyal army, they ordered him to disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen. To comply meant political oblivion, prosecution, exile, or worse. To defy them, however, meant war. The die, as Caesar would famously say, was about to be cast. The Republic stood at the brink, not through foreign invasion or collapse, but through its own internal contradictions, through the ambitions of its sons and the weakness of its systems. The next chapter would not be written by Senate debate or popular vote, but by sword and civil war. As we pause here, on the eve of that great unraveling, the quiet tension of history hangs in the air. Rome had built an empire abroad, but it was losing the ability to govern itself at home. The first triumvirate, born of backroom deals and mutual ambition, had fractured the old order. And Caesar, with Gaul at his back and Rome at his feet, now stood poised to challenge the Republic itself. The story of its fall had truly begun. In 49 BCE, Julius Caesar stood on the banks of a modest river in northern Italy, known as the Rubicon. By Roman law, no general was permitted to lead an army across it and into the heart of Italy. To do so was to declare war on the Roman state itself. Yet Caesar, aware of the Senate's ultimatum and Pompey's growing power in Rome, made his decision. As legend tells it, he uttered the words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast, and crossed the Rubicon, igniting one of the most fateful civil wars in Roman history. What followed was not a swift seizure of power, but a drawn-out conflict between two titanic figures, Caesar and Pompey, once allies, now bitter enemies. The Roman world was forced to take sides. Some saw Caesar as a populist champion of reform and fairness, others as a dangerous autocrat. Pompey, aligned with the Senate and aristocracy, presented himself as the defender of the Republic, though in practice he too wielded extraordinary personal authority. Caesar moved quickly and decisively. As he marched south, town after town opened its gates to him. Many Romans were weary of the Senate's failures and attracted to Caesar's promises of stability and reform. Pompey, surprised by Caesar's rapid advance, fled Italy with his forces, regrouping in Greece and the eastern provinces. The war would span continents, from the Italian heartland to the plains of Pharsalus in northern Greece, where the two sides would finally meet in open battle. The Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE was a defining moment. Though outnumbered, Caesar's disciplined veterans crushed Pompey's larger forces. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge, but was betrayed and murdered upon arrival. The severed head of his former ally and rival was presented to Caesar, a brutal end to a once great Roman. Caesar, notably, was horrified by the act and mourned Pompey's death. Even amid war, there were lines that, to Caesar, should not have been crossed. But the war was not yet over. Caesar continued to campaign, quelling remaining resistance in the east and famously traveling to Egypt. There, he encountered Cleopatra VII, the young and ambitious queen caught in her own dynastic struggles. Their alliance, both political and romantic, would leave a lasting mark on history. With Cleopatra, Caesar restored order in Egypt and fathered a child, Caesarion, though he would never formally recognize him as heir. By 46 BCE, Caesar returned to Rome, victorious and unchallenged. The Senate, many of whom owed their positions to him, showered him with honors. He was declared dictator, first for 10 years, and then for life. Caesar implemented sweeping reforms, reorganizing the calendar into the now familiar Julian model, expanding the Senate, reducing debts, and granting citizenship to many in the provinces. His vision was imperial and pragmatic, a centralized, modernized state under a single guiding hand. Yet beneath the surface, unease simmered. Many senators feared Caesar's growing dominance, his disregard for traditional republican procedures, his perpetual dictatorship, and his seeming ambition to be crowned king unnerved Rome's elite. To them, Caesar was not just a reformer, he was the death knell of the Republic. On the Ides of March, 44 BCE, March 15th, Caesar entered the theatre of Pompey for a meeting of the Senate. There, he was surrounded by conspirators led by Brutus and Cassius, men he once trusted. With daggers hidden beneath their togas, they stabbed him 23 times. According to legend, Caesar's last words were, "Et tu, Brute," "You too, Brutus," a haunting cry not just of betrayal, but of heartbreak. The assassination did not restore the Republic as the conspirators had hoped. Instead, it unleashed chaos. Rome mourned, not celebrated. The citizens who had loved Caesar for his generosity and boldness turned on the killers. The Republic, already mortally wounded, would not recover. Caesar's death would soon give rise to another war, and eventually to something new entirely. An empire. As the dust settled, Rome stood on the threshold of a new era. The Republic was no more. The dream of shared power had given way to the reality of rule by the sword. Yet in the calm of hindsight, we remember Caesar not only for the wars he fought or the reforms he enacted, but for how his life marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. He had crossed the Rubicon, and so had Rome. In the wake of Julius Caesar's assassination, Rome did not find peace. It unraveled. The senators who had hoped to preserve the Republic found themselves caught in a whirlwind of popular outrage, power struggles, and civil unrest. The vacuum left by Caesar's death was quickly filled by men who had either inherited his mantle or sought to avenge his memory. Foremost among them was Gaius Octavius, later known to history as Augustus, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted heir. At just 19 years old, Octavian seemed an unlikely contender. He was pale, slight, and untested in battle. Yet he possessed a quiet determination, an unshakable sense of purpose, and an uncanny political instinct. Recognizing the power of Caesar's name, he styled himself as Caesar's son and skillfully aligned with Caesar's loyalists and veterans. The Senate, desperate to maintain control, initially underestimated him, but Octavian quickly proved he was not to be sidelined. To consolidate power and neutralize the threat of Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, Octavian entered into a precarious alliance with two powerful men, Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted lieutenant, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, a senior statesman with military clout. This trio formed what came to be known as the Second Triumvirate, a legally sanctioned three-man dictatorship granted sweeping powers by the Senate in 43 BCE. Together, the triumvirs launched a brutal campaign against Caesar's killers and their sympathizers. Proscriptions, a chilling practice of listing political enemies for execution, were revived, and scores of senators and equestrians were killed. The poet Virgil's patron, Cicero, a staunch defender of the Republic, met his end during this purge. Justice, in the eyes of the triumvirs, was swift and ruthless. In 42 BCE, the triumvirs met the forces of Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi in Macedonia. The confrontation was decisive. Both leaders of the conspirators died by suicide, and the last serious hope of a republican revival died with them. But the alliance that won the battle was already showing cracks. Lepidus, increasingly marginalized and distrusted, was eventually stripped of power and exiled, leaving Octavian and Mark Antony as rivals for control of the Roman world. Mark Antony, bold and charismatic, took control of the eastern provinces. He soon aligned himself with Cleopatra VII of Egypt, both politically and romantically. Their union was not just personal, it was strategic. Cleopatra, still a powerful monarch, offered Antony wealth and naval strength, while Antony promised her a shared rule and the restoration of Egypt's former grandeur. To many in Rome, however, this alliance with the foreign queen stirred deep anxieties. Octavian, ever the strategist, seized the moment. Through a masterful propaganda campaign, he painted Antony as a man seduced by Eastern decadence, corrupted by a foreign woman, and willing to betray Rome for Alexandria. Cleopatra became the face of the Eastern threat, and Antony the traitor who would turn Rome into an Eastern monarchy. Octavian positioned himself as the defender of Roman tradition and Roman dignity. The growing tension erupted in 31 BCE in one of antiquity's most famous naval clashes, the Battle of Actium. On the Ionian Sea, off the coast of Greece, the fleets of Octavian and Antony met. Octavian's forces, commanded by his trusted general Agrippa, held the tactical advantage. Cleopatra, present with her Egyptian fleet, reportedly panicked or preemptively withdrew from the fight. Antony followed her in retreat, leaving his fleet leaderless. The battle was lost. The aftermath was swift and tragic. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt. Pursued relentlessly, they eventually took their own lives, Antony falling on his sword, and Cleopatra, according to legend, by the bite of an asp. Egypt, once a proud and independent civilization, was absorbed into Rome as a province. Octavian returned to Rome not just as a victor, but as the uncontested master of the Roman world. The age of civil wars had come to an end. The Republic, though still named in rituals and institutions, was functionally over. Rome was no longer a state of rotating consuls and senatorial debate. It was now the realm of a single ruler. But Octavian, ever cautious, did not declare himself king. He understood that Romans, even after years of chaos, still feared monarchy. Instead, he would transform Rome through subtlety and ceremony, becoming not a tyrant, but something far more enduring: the first emperor. The rise of Augustus, his new name, marked the beginning of an empire that would span centuries. But in these early days, as temples were rebuilt and roads extended, as the Senate was restored in name but not in power, it was clear that a new Roman order had begun, not through revolution, but through consolidation, strategy, and the quiet vision of a young man from an old family who had turned Caesar's legacy into a new world. After the dust of civil war had settled, and the banners of Mark Antony and Cleopatra lay tattered in the silence of history, Octavian returned to Rome not simply as a victor, but as something rarer still, a peacemaker in a fractured world. The Senate, worn and weary, hailed him as savior. The people, exhausted from generations of war, cheered his name. But Octavian understood something that had eluded many before him. Power that appears absolute invites rebellion. Power that feels shared, however symbolic, endures. In 27 BCE, Octavian made a grand gesture. He publicly returned his extraordinary powers to the Senate and people of Rome. In response, the Senate awarded him the title Augustus, a name that conveyed reverence and divinely sanctioned authority without the offensive associations of monarchy. He was also given the title Princeps, meaning first citizen. Thus began the Principate, a political system carefully crafted to preserve the outward forms of the Roman Republic while consolidating control in the hands of one man. Under the Principate, Augustus held multiple roles: consul, tribune, censor, and pontifex maximus, each offering him jurisdiction over different facets of Roman life. He controlled the legions through his position as imperator, and through shrewd appointments and financial patronage, he ensured that provincial governors, tax collectors, and military commanders owed their loyalty to him. Yet the Senate continued to meet. Elections still occurred. Laws were still debated. To the Roman eye, the Republic lived on. But in truth, it breathed through the lungs of Augustus alone. His genius was not in conquest, though he had seen battles, nor was it in philosophical innovation, like Cicero before him. Augustus's gift was stability. He understood that the heart of empire did not beat in the swords of legions, but in the roads that connected distant cities, in the aqueducts that brought water to homes, in the temples that reassured the gods' favor, and in the grain shipments that filled bellies from Carthage to Corinth. Empire, in his hands, became an administrative miracle. Thus began the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a 200-year stretch of relative stability and prosperity unmatched in the ancient world. From the chilly coasts of Britannia to the bustling markets of Alexandria, from the Rhine's wooded frontier to the sun-baked roads of Judea, a vast network of peoples were held together under Roman order. It was not a peace without tension or rebellion, but it was a peace strong enough to absorb them. Augustus invested in infrastructure and city planning, transforming Rome from what he famously claimed was a city of brick into a city of marble. He reformed the tax system, established a permanent standing army and navy, and instituted a civil service that professionalized governance. The postal system was expanded, and the famed Roman roads were extended deeper into the provinces, allowing not just goods and soldiers to move efficiently, but also ideas and cultures. Cultural life flourished. Poets like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid found patronage in the imperial court. Virgil's Aeneid, a sweeping epic tying Rome's founding to the hero Aeneas, became both national mythology and imperial propaganda. Art and architecture celebrated not just Roman gods and victories, but the order and glory Augustus had brought to the known world. Yet Augustus was not without his challenges. He faced conspiracies, family scandals, and anxieties about succession. His only biological child, Julia, was eventually exiled for alleged moral transgressions, and several of his favoured heirs died young. It was his stepson, Tiberius, who would ultimately succeed him, not a choice of love, but of necessity. Despite these personal sorrows, Augustus remained deeply respected, even deified after his death in 14 CE. Upon his passing, Rome did not erupt into chaos, as it had after Caesar's assassination. The system he created was sturdy enough to carry on, at least for a time. His funeral was a grand affair. The Senate declared him a god. The people mourned a man who had ruled for over 4 decades without once calling himself a king. The rise of Augustus marks one of the most important transitions in world history, the shift from a turbulent republic to a unified empire. Through a careful blend of power and restraint, tradition and innovation, he laid the foundations of a Roman identity that would echo for centuries. Under his steady hand, the Mediterranean world found something rare and precious: peace. Not a perfect peace, and not a permanent one, but a peace that allowed millions to live, trade, worship, and dream under the banner of a shared Roman destiny. As the first emperor, Augustus did not merely seize control, he redefined it. In doing so, he set the tone for an entire age, where emperors would follow in his shadow, judged not just by the victories they won, but by the peace they could preserve. Following the long and stabilizing rule of Augustus, Rome now stood at a crossroads. With the Principate firmly established, the next generations of rulers were tasked not with founding empire, but with preserving, expanding, and embodying it. What unfolded over the next 50 years was a period marked by brilliance and cruelty, innovation and excess, as the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the first imperial family of Rome, took the stage. Tiberius, the adopted son of Augustus and his reluctant successor, began his reign in 14 CE. A seasoned general and competent administrator, Tiberius had spent much of his life in the shadow of Augustus's greatness. When he finally came to power, he maintained many of his predecessors' policies: modesty in public life, discipline in military affairs, and caution in foreign policy. Yet despite his skills, Tiberius was no lover of spectacle. Withdrawn and often suspicious, he gradually distanced himself from Rome, retreating to the island of Capri, where he ruled through letters and informants. While the empire functioned well in his absence, whispers of tyranny began to circulate. Tiberius increasingly relied on his praetorian prefect, Sejanus, who ran the capital like a shadow regent, until a sudden fall from grace led to his execution. The latter part of Tiberius's rule became known for treason trials and purges, reflecting a deepening atmosphere of fear. He was succeeded by Caligula, the grand-nephew of Tiberius and the great-grandson of Augustus. Caligula's rise in 37 CE was met with jubilation. Known for his charisma and as the beloved son of the popular general Germanicus, the young emperor initially promised a return to enlightened rule. But that promise quickly unraveled. Historians, writing after his death, describe a descent into erratic and disturbing behavior. He declared himself a living god, built golden statues of himself, and is rumoured to have named his horse a consul. Whether these tales are exaggerations or not, Caligula's reign ended abruptly. He was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard after just 4 years in power. In the chaos that followed, an unlikely figure emerged, Claudius, Caligula's uncle. Considered weak and bookish by many, Claudius had been largely ignored by the political elite, possibly due to a speech impediment and awkward demeanour. But when the guards found him hiding behind a curtain in the palace, they declared him emperor in 41 CE. Claudius would surprise everyone. A historian by training, Claudius brought a scholar's mind to governance. He implemented major administrative reforms, expanded the Roman bureaucracy, and, crucially, began to incorporate more provincials, especially from Gaul, into the Roman elite. Under his rule, the empire grew significantly. His most notable military achievement was the conquest of Britain in 43 CE, a campaign that expanded Roman influence to the foggy edges of the known world. Claudius also invested heavily in public works. He restored aqueducts, built new roads and canals, and improved grain supply infrastructure, which helped stabilize Rome's food economy. His reign proved that competence did not require charisma, and that even those underestimated by history could leave lasting marks on empire. Yet Claudius's personal life was far less orderly. His final wife, Agrippina the Younger, manipulated her way into power, pushing Claudius to adopt her son, Nero, as his heir. In 54 CE, Claudius died, many suspect by poison, and Nero ascended the throne. The early years of Nero's reign were promising. Guided by wise tutors such as the Stoic philosopher Seneca, Nero promoted the arts, public performances, and sporting events. He reduced taxes and sought to improve the lives of ordinary Romans. However, the darker side of his rule soon emerged. As he grew increasingly paranoid and megalomaniacal, political rivals, real or imagined, were eliminated. He ordered the execution of his own mother, Agrippina, and later Seneca himself. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, which destroyed much of the city, became a turning point. Nero's decision to build a grand golden house, Domus Aurea, on the cleared land enraged many. Although he blamed and persecuted Christians for the fire, public trust eroded. His later years were marked by rebellion, military desertion, and extravagance that pushed Rome to the brink. Despite the growing chaos, the Julio-Claudian emperors continued many of Augustus's public and administrative projects. They maintained the grain dole, oversaw road building in the provinces, funded temples and theatres, and worked to keep the empire's machinery in motion. Even under flawed leadership, the Roman system, bureaucratic, military, and civic, endured. By the time Nero took his own life in 68 CE, the Julio-Claudian dynasty had come to a dramatic and final end. What followed was a year of civil war and multiple claimants to the throne. Yet the legacy of the dynasty remained. It had taken the Roman Empire from Augustus's golden calm into a whirlwind of personalities, intrigues, and contradictions. Glory and madness, side by side, had defined its first imperial lineage. By the time Nero reached the height of his reign, Rome had become an empire both magnificent and fragile. Beneath the marble facades and the grand amphitheatres, a slow and steady disintegration had begun, one driven not by external enemies, but from within. The descent into tyranny, subtle at first, would soon become unmistakable, casting a long shadow over the final years of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Nero's early reign, guided by advisors like Seneca and Burrus, showed hints of balance, but the harmony was short-lived. As Nero's personal tastes clashed with the responsibilities of rule, he grew more erratic and self-absorbed. Increasingly consumed by a desire for artistic fame, Nero performed in theatrical productions and sang for hours before audiences who dared not leave. His passion for performance, so unconventional for a Roman emperor, became symbolic of his widening disconnect from governance and the people. A turning point arrived with the mysterious Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. Though the cause remains unknown, many Romans believed Nero had started it to clear space for his vast Domus Aurea, a golden palace complex that would include man-made lakes, gardens, and rotating dining rooms. Nero blamed the Christians, a small and largely misunderstood sect at the time, initiating one of the first state-sponsored persecutions in Roman history. Yet public suspicion lingered. His reputation, already fragile, began to collapse under the weight of rumor and extravagance. In the years that followed, Nero's paranoia deepened. He executed many of Rome's elite, senators, generals, even family members, based on vague accusations of disloyalty. The philosopher Seneca, once his trusted tutor, was forced to take his own life after being implicated in a plot. These purges stripped the Senate of its most capable voices and created an atmosphere of fear and silence. Where Augustus had ruled with careful deference to republican forms, Nero acted as though divine right alone sustained his authority. This growing isolation from the Senate and aristocracy reflected a deeper flaw in the imperial structure. Since Augustus, emperors had maintained a delicate balance between autocracy and tradition, governing absolutely, yet in the language of the Republic. Augustus had styled himself as princeps, or first citizen, rather than king. He worked in tandem with the Senate, preserving its dignity even as he controlled its power. His successors, too, walked this tightrope, sometimes with grace, sometimes by force. Nero, however, shattered this equilibrium. The Senate, once a co-guardian of the state, was now a fearful audience. Decisions were made through imperial whims, not debate. The line between emperor and entertainer, ruler and tyrant, blurred completely. Rome's institutions, resilient though they were, could no longer mask the personal rule of a single, volatile man. The final years of Nero's reign were marked by uprisings and betrayals. Rebellions flared in the provinces, in Gaul, Spain, and especially in Judea, where the Jewish revolt would later lead to the destruction of the Second Temple. Even Rome's own legions began to abandon him. In 68 CE, the governor of Hispania, Galba, declared himself emperor with the support of the Praetorian Guard. Facing near-universal rejection, Nero fled the city. According to historical sources, Nero wandered outside Rome for a time before retreating to a villa. There, learning that he had been condemned as a public enemy, he uttered his final words, "Qualis artifex pereo," or "What an artist dies in me," and took his own life. With Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian line came to an end, and with it, the illusion of dynastic stability. The fall of Nero marked more than the end of a single reign. It underscored the vulnerabilities built into the imperial system. As long as the Senate had no real power to check an emperor's excesses, and as long as loyalty from the legions could shift with a promise of money or fame, Rome would remain exposed to the turbulence of succession and personality. The Senate, for its part, had long since ceased to be a counterbalance. By the end of the Julio-Claudian period, it was reduced to a ceremonial body, offering symbolic legitimacy to rulers who wielded unchecked force. This imbalance between imperial ambition and senatorial dignity would define future crises and civil wars. And yet, the Roman state endured. The roads still connected the provinces. Grain still flowed from Egypt. Temples still stood, and aqueducts still ran. The empire's machinery was vast enough to survive even its most self-destructive leaders. As the curtain closed on the Julio-Claudians, Rome stood again at a crossroads. The year ahead, known as the Year of the Four Emperors, would test whether the empire could regenerate without a divine bloodline, whether the idea of Rome could outlast even the men who ruled it. The question of power and legitimacy would remain unresolved and dangerous for generations to come. In the long, winding story of the Roman Empire, few chapters are as serene and admired as the era of the 5 good emperors. From the end of the 1st century to the close of the 2nd, Rome experienced a rare century of stability, prosperity, and relative good governance. The emperors of this golden age, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, were not bound by bloodline, but rather by a tradition of adopting a worthy successor. Their reigns, though not without challenges, brought Rome to its intellectual, architectural, and administrative height. The first of these emperors, Nerva, came to power in 96 CE after the assassination of the unpopular Domitian. A respected senator of advanced age, Nerva's short reign was more transitional than transformational. Yet he laid down a precedent that would guide his successors. He adopted a capable and respected general, Trajan, as his heir, rather than relying on family succession. This act of wisdom, choosing ability over lineage, set the tone for the next century. Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 CE, brought Rome to its greatest geographical reach. A soldier-emperor by background, Trajan was admired not only for his military brilliance, but also for his civic concern. His campaigns in Dacia, modern-day Romania, were both brutal and decisive, culminating in the annexation of a wealthy and resource-rich province. His victories were immortalized in the spiraling reliefs of Trajan's Column, which still stands in Rome today, an artistic and historical triumph capturing the grit of Roman warfare and conquest. Under Trajan, the empire reached its maximum territorial expansion. His eastern campaigns against the Parthians resulted in the brief annexation of Armenia and Mesopotamia, pushing Rome's boundaries to the Persian Gulf. Though these gains were hard to sustain, they marked a high-water mark of Roman ambition. Never again would Rome control such vast and diverse lands, from the sands of the Sahara to the moors of northern Britain, from the Atlantic Ocean to the edge of the Euphrates. Trajan was not merely a conqueror. At home, he invested heavily in infrastructure, roads, aqueducts, public baths, and welfare programs. His alimenta, a form of state-supported child welfare, aimed to sustain the rural poor and encourage population growth. He also engaged the Senate more constructively than many of his predecessors, striking a balance between imperial authority and republican tradition. Upon Trajan's death, the reins of empire passed smoothly to his adoptive son, Hadrian. If Trajan expanded the empire, Hadrian consolidated it. He recognized the limits of Roman control and wisely withdrew from overextended eastern territories. His focus turned inward, toward defending the frontiers and fostering internal harmony. The most iconic symbol of his reign is Hadrian's Wall, stretching across northern Britain, built not as an aggressive barrier, but as a stabilizing line, a statement of the empire's limits and resolve. Hadrian was also a lover of the arts, philosophy, and architecture. He traveled extensively across the empire, from the Nile to the Aegean, seeking to connect personally with the diverse peoples under his rule. His villa at Tivoli remains a masterpiece of Roman design, combining influences from across the Mediterranean world. A patron of the Hellenistic spirit, he invested in Athens, reshaping it into a cultural hub that echoed Rome's philosophical ambitions. After Hadrian came Antoninus Pius, whose reign from 138 to 161 CE is often remembered for its peaceful and uneventful nature, in the best sense of the term. There were no major wars, no political purges, and few crises. The empire thrived under his just and mild rule. Antoninus was known for his respect for Senate protocol, legal reforms, and for maintaining a budgetary surplus without raising taxes. His reign became a model for the ideal Roman ruler, restrained, ethical, and wise. The final of the five was Marcus Aurelius, often called the Philosopher King. His reign, though marked by invasions and plagues, was elevated by his inner life. He penned the Meditations, a collection of personal reflections grounded in Stoic philosophy, during his military campaigns. These writings remain among the most treasured works of ancient wisdom, revealing a ruler deeply concerned with duty, virtue, and the impermanence of power. Together, these five emperors guided Rome through a century of relative harmony. They offered something rare in imperial history, a succession based on merit, not dynastic privilege. Though this golden age would not last forever, it stands in memory as a period when wisdom, moderation, and foresight ruled more often than fear or ambition. As the empire basked in its zenith, the seeds of future turmoil were already sown, quiet and unnoticed. But for a brief and remarkable time, the Roman world seemed balanced, prosperous, powerful, and secure. The sun stood high in the Roman sky. As the Roman Empire reached its zenith under the five good emperors, a transition was quietly taking place, a shift from the fever of conquest to the discipline of preservation. The reigns of Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius in particular symbolize this nuanced pivot. Though Rome's armies still stood strong and its cities glimmered with marble and wealth, the empire's most thoughtful rulers now sought to consolidate rather than conquer, fortify rather than expand. Their governance was not merely political, it was philosophical, grounded in a belief that strength also meant self-restraint. One of the most enduring physical manifestations of this philosophy is Hadrian's Wall, constructed beginning around 122 CE in northern Britannia. Stretching over 70 miles from coast to coast, the wall did not only serve as a military bulwark, it was a symbol of boundary and balance. Unlike his predecessor Trajan, who had pushed Rome's frontiers eastward into Mesopotamia, Hadrian believed that Rome's strength lay in managing what it already held. The wall marked a clear line. This is Rome, and beyond this, barbarian lands. With a series of forts, watchtowers, and mile castles, Hadrian's Wall served both as defense and declaration. The empire no longer needed to grow to prove its power. Hadrian's travels throughout the empire reinforced this vision of consolidation. He was one of the few emperors to journey extensively across the provinces, not as a conqueror, but as an administrator and observer. From Egypt to Gaul, from Judea to Athens, Hadrian met governors, reviewed legions, and engaged with local cultures. His governance model was subtle but powerful. Cultivate unity not through uniformity, but through respect for local identity under Roman structure. It was this practical cosmopolitanism that allowed the empire to sustain its enormous reach without constant upheaval. Hadrian's consolidation laid the groundwork for the final two emperors of the Golden Era, particularly Marcus Aurelius, whose personal legacy was far more philosophical than administrative. While his reign, 161 to 180 CE, was marred by war, plague, and unrest, Marcus is best remembered not for his military campaigns, but for the quiet force of his inner life. During his long and difficult campaigns along the Danube frontier, Marcus Aurelius kept a private journal, written in Greek, known today as the Meditations. This collection of reflections, meditations, and philosophical reminders was not intended for publication. They were a form of self-discipline, a stoic exercise in remaining centered amid the chaos of imperial responsibility. In these writings, Marcus Aurelius speaks not as an emperor, but as a man wrestling with impermanence, grief, obligation, and virtue. He reminds himself that you could leave life right now and urges, let that determine what you do and say and think. It is this raw vulnerability, balanced with ethical resolve, that has made the Meditations timeless. Through Stoicism, Marcus found clarity in the impermanence of life, the inevitability of suffering, and the need to act in accordance with reason and nature. His beliefs echoed those of earlier Stoics like Epictetus and Seneca, yet his position as emperor gave them a dramatic weight. He was both the most powerful man in the world and yet a servant of fate. Even as he commanded legions, his thoughts dwelled on how to govern oneself above all. The Meditations reflect the broader tone of imperial leadership during this golden age. Governance guided by philosophy, restraint, and duty. This period was not perfect. No empire ever is. But under these emperors, Rome achieved a remarkable balance. Infrastructure projects flourished. Legal systems became more consistent. Trade flowed freely across provinces. Education and the arts were cultivated. Cities thrived not only in Italy, but in Gaul, Asia Minor, and North Africa. Peace, for once, did not feel like a prelude to conquest, but an accomplishment of statecraft. This golden age also marked a high point in imperial legitimacy. The Senate was respected, the people were fed, and succession, though informal, was handled with foresight. By choosing successors based on merit and character rather than inheritance, each emperor tried to pass the torch responsibly. This wasn't just good policy, it was philosophy in action, and it worked for a time. But golden ages never last forever. The final years of Marcus Aurelius's reign foreshadowed the coming turbulence. The Antonine Plague, likely a form of smallpox, ravaged the population. Germanic tribes pressed harder against the frontiers. And most crucially, Marcus broke the tradition of adoptive succession by naming his biological son, Commodus, as his heir. What followed would begin Rome's long descent. Yet, for nearly a century, Rome had been governed by men who saw empire as more than conquest and power as more than privilege. They viewed rulership as an exercise in wisdom and restraint, and in doing so, they left behind not only monuments and coins, but a model of thoughtful governance that still resonates. It was an empire not at war with itself, but in balance, an age where stone walls and silent meditations were expressions of a deeper strength. The calm, golden centuries of Rome were not to last. As the 2nd century gave way to the 3rd, the grandeur of the empire began to fracture from within. It did not happen all at once, like a building crumbling overnight. Instead, it unraveled slowly, like fabric fraying at the edges, quietly at first, then all at once. The 3rd century, often called the crisis of the 3rd century, was an age of turbulence. Gone was the philosophical calm of the 5 good emperors. In its place arose a chaotic rotation of rulers known as the barracks emperors, a procession of generals elevated by their troops rather than any civic process or senatorial consent. These barracks emperors were a reflection of a deeper shift in Roman politics. Military power now outweighed all other forms of legitimacy. Emperors came and went, not through debate or succession planning, but through the strength of swords. Soldiers, often stationed in far-flung provinces, declared their commanders as emperors, marched on Rome, and overthrew a current ruler. Some emperors reigned for a few years, others mere months. Between 235 and 284 CE, Rome saw over 26 emperors, many meeting violent ends. This revolving door of rulers created an atmosphere of deep instability. Each new emperor would often lavish wealth on the soldiers who supported him, both as reward and as bribe, draining the treasury and weakening civil institutions. Governance became reactionary, emergency-focused. Taxation grew erratic. Law enforcement broke down in distant provinces. Corruption thrived where imperial attention faltered. But it wasn't only internal unrest that plagued Rome in the 3rd century. Across its vast frontiers, external threats grew bolder. Germanic tribes like the Goths, Vandals and Alemanni pushed against the northern borders. In the east, the Sassanid Empire of Persia, newly energized under kings like Shapur I, launched aggressive campaigns into Roman territories. These invasions weren't brief raids. They were organized assaults, often capturing entire cities, taking prisoners, and demanding massive ransoms. The Roman legions, stretched thin and loyal more to commanders than to Rome itself, were often unable to respond in time. One particularly devastating moment came in 260 CE, when the Emperor Valerian, leading a campaign against Persia, was captured alive by Shapur III, the first and only Roman emperor to be taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. Valerian's humiliation was used as propaganda by the Sassanids, with some accounts claiming he was used as a human footstool or executed in captivity. Regardless of the details, the symbolism was devastating. If an emperor could be taken and paraded like a trophy, what hope did the empire have of projecting authority or invincibility? Even more insidious than foreign invasions or internal anarchy was the plague, a silent and invisible enemy that sapped Rome's strength from within. The so-called Plague of Cyprian, named after the bishop who documented its effects, ravaged the empire beginning around 249 CE. The disease, possibly smallpox or a viral hemorrhagic fever, spread rapidly through cities and military camps, killing thousands daily at its peak. Urban centers emptied. Farmlands were left untended. The economy, already weakened by constant warfare, began to spiral downward. In the wake of plagues and instability, the Roman economy began to collapse. Coinage was debased. Silver content in coins was diluted to stretch the treasury, leading to runaway inflation. Bread that once cost a few denarii could now require 100. Trade routes became dangerous as local warlords and bandits took advantage of the imperial disarray. Provinces began to act more independently, hoarding resources rather than sending them to Rome. The glue of the empire, its roads, its law, its common markets, began to loosen. And yet, amid the chaos, ordinary life went on. Citizens prayed to the old gods and increasingly to new ones. Christianity, still persecuted in many corners, quietly spread among the urban poor and soldiers alike. Temples were built, baths maintained, and children educated. But there was a growing sense that the world of old Rome, of unshakable emperors, peaceful provinces, and Pax Romana, was slipping away. The 3rd century was not merely a period of external invasion or failed leadership. It was a spiritual and psychological reckoning. The idea of Rome as eternal, orderly, and blessed by the gods was being tested on every front. The vast empire that once had confidently spread from the Atlantic to the Euphrates now seemed vulnerable, fragmented, and mortal. But empires, like people, are not defined only by their darkest chapters. Rome was battered, yes, but not broken. From this crucible of crisis would emerge figures determined to rebuild. The next phase of Rome's story would not be about unchecked expansion or philosophical grandeur, but about survival, reorganization, and adaptation. For now, though, the empire stood on a knife's edge, held together not by confidence, but by habit and inertia. A world empire, shaken to its core, waited to see what would come next. As the 3rd century dragged on, Rome's world felt increasingly unstable. Borders cracked under pressure, coinage crumbled in value, and the heart of the empire, its leadership, was locked in a relentless churn. But amid this chaos, certain figures arose, forged in the fire of crisis, who brought fleeting moments of clarity and cohesion. Among them stood one of the most remarkable, and perhaps underappreciated, of Roman emperors, Aurelian. Aurelian, who reigned from 270 to 275 CE, was a product of his time. A seasoned soldier from humble origins in the Balkans, he rose not through noble birth or political cunning, but through sheer military prowess and discipline. Known among his troops as manu ad ferrum, hand on sword, Aurelian was a warrior emperor in the truest sense, embodying the harsh virtues required to hold a crumbling empire together. His reign was short, yet it burned brightly. When Aurelian took the throne, Rome was fractured almost beyond recognition. In the east, the Palmyrene Empire, ruled by Queen Zenobia, had broken away, claiming much of Syria, Egypt, and parts of Asia Minor. In the west, the Gallic Empire, an offshoot centered in Gaul and Britain, had declared independence decades earlier. What had once been a unified Rome now looked like a shattered mirror, each shard reflecting part of the whole but loyal only to itself. Aurelian's first task was consolidation. With unyielding energy, he launched military campaigns across the empire. In the east, he defeated Zenobia's forces and captured the queen herself, marching her in a triumphal parade through Rome. He then turned westward, reclaiming the Gallic provinces through a blend of warfare and diplomacy. By 274 CE, Aurelian had restored the territorial unity of the empire, earning him the title Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World. Yet his accomplishments extended beyond the battlefield. Recognizing the vulnerability of Rome itself to barbarian raids, Aurelian began construction on what would become the Aurelian Walls, a defensive ring that still stands today in parts of modern Rome. Unlike the older Republican walls, these were massive, enclosing not just the Forum and Palatine Hill, but the expanded urban sprawl of the imperial capital. It was a quiet admission that the old confidence of open cities, of borders held far from Rome's doorstep, was gone. Now, even the heart of the empire needed protection. Aurelian also tried to impose order on Rome's tangled religious landscape. He promoted Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, as a unifying imperial cult, hoping to bridge the growing divide between traditional Roman polytheism and the rapidly spreading Christian communities. He reorganized grain distribution, reformed the currency in a bid to counter inflation, and cracked down on corruption in the mint. But like so many before him, Aurelian's life ended violently. In 275 CE, amid rumors that he planned to purge the imperial bureaucracy, a group of conspirators, possibly palace officials fearing retribution, assassinated him. His death was a bitter reminder that even the strongest soldier emperors could not escape the brutal cycle of Roman politics. Despite his efforts, the deeper fractures in Rome remained. The empire was no longer a seamless body. It was a patchwork of provinces, each with its own loyalties, leaders, and vulnerabilities. As soon as one fire was extinguished, another flared up, whether from internal rebellion, border invasions, or economic collapse. While Aurelian had briefly stitched the empire back together, the seams were fragile and already beginning to pull apart again. In the decades that followed, the empire saw continued instability. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession, often dying by betrayal or battle. Local commanders gained more power, and many cities began prioritizing their own survival over imperial cohesion. Provinces that once sent grain, taxes, and tribute to Rome now hoarded them, fearing disruption. Civil authority became overshadowed by military necessity. Meanwhile, cracks in the empire's social and spiritual fabric deepened. Christianity, once a minority religion scorned by emperors, began gaining influence and structure, especially among the lower classes and military ranks. Pagan cults adapted or faded, temples lost funding, and the very identity of Roman started to shift. It was no longer defined by citizenship or culture alone, but by survival, adaptation, and changing allegiances. Rome, the eternal city, still stood, but it stood in the midst of transformation. The empire had weathered civil war, economic collapse, plague, and invasion. What remained was more brittle, more militarized, and more uncertain. The grandeur of the Republic and early empire had given way to something rougher, less idealistic, and more desperate. As the 3rd century came to a close, Rome's leaders recognized the need for radical reorganization. The old structures no longer held. The imperial apparatus would need to evolve or break entirely. In the next chapter of its long story, Rome would undergo a dramatic transformation. The Tetrarchy, the rise of Diocletian, and the seeds of what would eventually become the Eastern and Western Roman empires. But before all that, the empire would first have to survive the night. As the 3rd century faded into the 4th, the Roman Empire found itself teetering on a precipice. Nearly a century of military anarchy, economic collapse, and regional fragmentation had worn the old imperial machinery to the bone. It was in this moment of prolonged crisis that a figure rose from obscurity, not to patch the old system, but to remake it. His name was Diocletian, and his reforms would fundamentally alter the structure of Rome. Born to a modest family in Dalmatia, Diocletian was a career military man, hardened by frontier campaigns and skilled in command. In 284 CE, following the assassination of Emperor Carus and his son, Diocletian was proclaimed emperor by his troops. But rather than imitate the brief, autocratic reigns of his predecessors, Diocletian approached governance with a strategist's eye. He did not seek to be simply the next man on the throne. He sought to rebuild the throne itself. His most famous and radical innovation was the tetrarchy, or rule of four. Recognizing that the empire was too vast and complex to be effectively ruled by a single person, Diocletian divided power among four emperors. He took the title of Augustus of the East, appointing his trusted general Maximian as Augustus of the West. Beneath them, each Augustus named a Caesar, a junior emperor, who would serve as both a deputy and designated successor. Galerius was named Caesar in the east, and Constantius Chlorus in the west. This tetrarchic system was not merely symbolic, it was geographic, administrative, and military. Each ruler had control over a specific territory, along with their own court, army, and bureaucracy. Diocletian ruled from Nicomedia in modern-day Turkey. Maximian governed from Milan. Galerius operated from Sirmium, and Constantius from Trier. Rome, while still venerated, was no longer the operational heart of the empire. The idea was simple. By dividing responsibility and decentralizing power, the empire could respond more swiftly to threats, prevent civil wars over succession, and ensure a smooth transition of authority. In practice, the system was elegant but fragile. It relied on loyalty, shared purpose, and mutual respect, rare commodities in Roman politics. In tandem with the tetrarchy, Diocletian launched a sweeping set of economic and administrative reforms aimed at shoring up the empire's internal stability. After decades of runaway inflation, coin debasement, and regional price shocks, the Roman economy was in disarray. Diocletian issued the edict on maximum prices in 301 CE, an ambitious attempt to curb inflation by placing strict limits on the cost of goods and services across the empire. The edict covered everything from the price of wheat to the wages of mule drivers, and punishments for violation were harsh. Yet despite its thoroughness, enforcement proved nearly impossible across such a vast and varied territory. The edict's failure became a cautionary tale in economic history, an early example of price controls overwhelmed by market forces. Still, Diocletian made progress in stabilizing the currency. He reintroduced a more reliable silver coin, the argentius, and attempted to restore faith in imperial minting. He also conducted a comprehensive tax reform, reorganizing the tax base around fixed land values and population estimates. This process, known as the capitatio-iugatio system, grouped land and people into units for taxation, aiming for more predictable and sustainable revenue collection. On the administrative front, Diocletian expanded and formalized the imperial bureaucracy. Provinces were subdivided and grouped into larger dioceses, each managed by a vicarius under the broader supervision of the praetorian prefects. This created a layered hierarchical system intended to reduce corruption, distribute authority more evenly, and ensure that central directives could be executed effectively across distant regions. These reforms represented a massive increase in state oversight and structure, but they also led to a more rigid, heavily policed society. The days of the old Roman aristocracy's informal power were fading. In their place arose a professional class of imperial functionaries, bureaucrats, tax collectors, and military officials, whose livelihoods depended on imperial favor and state machinery. Yet, with all this structural reshaping, Diocletian remained a deeply traditional man, particularly in religious matters. He saw Rome's troubles not only in terms of governance or economy, but also as a moral and spiritual decline. This would manifest most sharply in his persecution of Christians, one of the last and most violent waves of imperial hostility against the growing religion. He saw their refusal to sacrifice to the Roman gods as not just impiety, but a threat to civic unity and divine favor. The result was the Great Persecution, a brutal campaign that would ultimately fail, but which left lasting scars. In 305 CE, after 2 decades of transformative rule, Diocletian did something almost unthinkable for a Roman emperor. He voluntarily abdicated, retiring to his palace in Split, modern-day Croatia. There, he is said to have tended to his gardens and declined all calls to return to power. His reforms did not end Rome's problems, but they bought it time. The empire he left behind was more centralized, more bureaucratic, and more durable. The tetrarchy would not survive long after his departure, but the structural ideas, divided rule, regional administration, strengthened imperial authority, would echo throughout the rest of Roman history. And just on the horizon, another man was rising, one who would not just inherit Diocletian's legacy, but transform it into a new era. His name was Constantine. As the sun set on Diocletian's era of reform, the Roman Empire stood at a crossroads, newly stabilized, yet still fractured in purpose and identity. Into this moment of transition stepped Constantine, a man whose reign would reshape the Roman world not only politically, but spiritually and culturally. If Diocletian restructured the body of Rome, Constantine transformed its soul. Born around 272 CE in Naissus, modern-day Niš, Serbia, Constantine was the son of Constantius Chlorus, a Caesar in the western half of Diocletian's tetrarchy. After his father's death in 306 CE, Constantine was proclaimed emperor by his troops at Eboracum, modern-day York, England. But succession was no simple matter. The empire, still bound to the tetrarchic framework, quickly spiraled into civil war as multiple claimants to power arose. For nearly 2 decades, Constantine would navigate this shifting landscape, consolidating authority through a blend of military strength, political maneuvering, and visionary reform. One of the most pivotal moments in Constantine's rise and in the history of Western civilization occurred in 312 CE, on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. As he prepared to confront his rival Maxentius near Rome, Constantine reportedly received a divine vision. According to the historian Lactantius, he was instructed in a dream to mark his soldiers' shields with a strange symbol, a chiro, the overlapping Greek letters for Christ. Another version from Eusebius of Caesarea tells of a vision in the sky, a cross of light and the words, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign, conquer. Whichever the version, Constantine emerged victorious, entering Rome as the unchallenged ruler of the Western Empire. And whether born of genuine belief, political calculation, or some mixture of both, Constantine's encounter with Christianity marked a profound turning point. Though he was not baptized until shortly before his death, Constantine began to openly support Christianity and shift the empire's relationship with religion in ways that at once seemed unimaginable. In 313 CE, Constantine and his eastern counterpart Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, a proclamation that granted religious tolerance throughout the empire, most notably ending the persecution of Christians. Churches were returned to Christian communities, confiscated properties were restored, and for the first time, Christianity was legally protected. But Constantine went further. He actively supported the church, granting privileges to Christian clergy, funding the construction of basilicas, and involving himself in theological matters. His patronage signaled to the empire that Christianity was not merely tolerated, it was rising. The once persecuted faith began to grow not only in numbers, but in influence. In 325 CE, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, bringing together bishops from across the empire to settle disputes over doctrine, particularly the Arian controversy, which questioned the divinity of Christ. Though theological in nature, the council was also a political act. Constantine sought unity through creed, believing that religious discord threatened civic order. The Nicene Creed, still recited in many churches today, was a product of that effort. While Constantine's religious policies often define his legacy, his vision for Rome's future extended into the physical landscape of the empire. The traditional heart of the Roman world, the city of Rome itself, was steeped in pagan tradition and bound to a senatorial elite that Constantine viewed with cautious distance. He sought a new capital, one that would reflect the emerging fusion of Christian and imperial power. In 324 CE, after defeating Licinius and becoming sole ruler of the empire, Constantine chose the ancient Greek city of Byzantium as the site for this new capital. Strategically located on the Bosporus Strait between Europe and Asia, between the Aegean and the Black Sea, Byzantium was ideally placed for trade, defense, and communication. Over the next several years, the city was rebuilt and transformed on a monumental scale. Constantine spared no expense. Forums, palaces, churches, and administrative buildings were constructed, often adorned with artwork and columns taken from across the empire. Though pagan temples existed in the city, Constantine placed special emphasis on Christian spaces, signaling a new direction for imperial culture. In 330 CE, he officially dedicated the city as Nova Roma, New Rome, but the world would come to know it by another name, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. It would serve as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire for more than 1,000 years, becoming a beacon of Christian civilization long after the Western Empire crumbled. Constantine's reforms, religious, political, and architectural, were not without complexity. He was a man of contradictions, a warrior emperor who preached religious unity, a patron of the church who executed his own son and wife under dark circumstances, a man who wore the purple robe of empire while gazing toward the cross. Yet his impact is undeniable. With Constantine, Rome stepped into a new era. Christianity was no longer an outsider faith. It was enmeshed with imperial power. The city of Rome was no longer the sole heart of the empire. The East had risen, and the empire itself, once defined by pagan rituals and martial traditions, began to evolve into something altogether different, a Christian empire with a vision of divine order. As the empire moved into the 4th and 5th centuries, it carried Constantine's legacy forward. But with that legacy came new tensions, new divides, and new transformations that would again reshape the ancient world. The center had shifted, and the echoes would be felt for centuries to come. As the 5th century dawned over the Roman world, the western half of the empire stood like a weathered statue, once grand and commanding, now cracked by centuries of internal strain, economic instability, and overreach. While emperors still held court, issued edicts, and wore the purple, real power had grown more fragmented. Rome's strength no longer came from within, and the outside world, particularly the so-called barbarians, was beginning to close in. The term barbarian in Roman use simply meant anyone who lived outside the empire's cultural and political boundaries, often north and east of the Rhine and Danube. These groups were not a unified horde, as often imagined, but a mosaic of tribes: Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Franks, Huns, and others, each with distinct languages, customs, and internal politics. Some had served Rome as allies and mercenaries. Others saw the empire as a source of wealth and land to be seized. All were responding to pressures of their own: climate change, population movement, and the relentless expansion of the Huns from the east. The Visigoths, a Gothic people originally settled near the Danube, had long been in contact with the empire. In 376 CE, driven from their homelands by the advancing Huns, they sought asylum within Roman borders. But the welcome they received was anything but generous. Mismanagement, exploitation, and cruelty at the hands of Roman officials turned desperate refugees into a hostile force. In 378 CE, under their leader Fritigern, the Visigoths dealt a crushing blow to Rome at the Battle of Adrianople, killing the Eastern Emperor Valens and exposing the empire's vulnerability. For decades after Adrianople, the Visigoths remained a restless presence within imperial borders. Their leader in the early 5th century, Alaric I, sought recognition and land from Rome. Rebuffed and frustrated by broken promises, Alaric eventually led his forces toward the Eternal City itself. On August 24, 410 CE, the unthinkable happened: the sack of Rome. For 3 days, Visigothic troops roamed the city, looting but not destroying. They respected Christian churches, and bloodshed was relatively restrained by ancient standards. Yet the symbolic weight was enormous. Rome, undefeated by foreign enemies for over 800 years, had been humbled. The sack sent shockwaves throughout the empire. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, exclaimed, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." For many Romans, it felt as if the world order had collapsed. Though the empire still functioned, at least on paper, the myth of Rome's invincibility had been shattered. Not long after, another group made its mark: the Vandals. Originally from Central Europe, they had migrated westward in the chaos following the collapse of the Rhine frontier in 406 CE, crossing into Gaul and eventually into the Iberian Peninsula. Under their formidable king Gaiseric, the Vandals crossed into North Africa in 429 CE, seizing Carthage, one of Rome's wealthiest cities, in 439 CE. With control over the western Mediterranean's grain supply and a powerful fleet, the Vandals became not just raiders, but rulers. In 455 CE, they too would descend upon Rome. This second sack of Rome, led by Gaiseric, came in the wake of imperial assassination and civil strife. Though Pope Leo I negotiated to prevent widespread destruction, the Vandals looted the city methodically, stripping away treasures, art, and relics. Unlike Alaric's comparatively disciplined troops, Geiseric's sack was more thorough and more damaging, hence the enduring association of the word vandal with senseless destruction. Meanwhile, from the east came the terrifying force of the Huns. A nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia, the Huns had swept into Europe with speed and brutality, displacing other tribes and wreaking havoc on both Roman and non-Roman lands. Their most infamous leader, Attila the Hun, emerged in the 440 s as a scourge to both the Eastern and Western empires. Known as the Scourge of God, Attila demanded tribute from Constantinople, ravaged the Balkans, and turned his gaze westward. In 451 CE, Attila invaded Gaul, but was halted at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, where Roman general Flavius Aetius allied with various Germanic tribes to check the advance. The battle was indecisive, but it marked the high-water mark of Punic incursion. A year later, Attila invaded Italy itself, sacking northern cities and threatening Rome. Once again, Pope Leo I played the diplomat, meeting Attila personally, an event wrapped in both fact and legend. Attila withdrew, and soon after, in 453 CE, he died unexpectedly. His empire collapsed within a few years, relieving the immediate Hunnic pressure. Yet Rome, though spared from the Huns, was now surrounded by new powers and weakened from within. The imperial government had grown increasingly reliant on barbarian generals and federated allies, foederati, often granting them land in exchange for military service. Roman identity blurred, and the distinction between Roman and barbarian eroded. The West no longer dictated the terms. It bargained for survival. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self, its territories shrinking, its economy disrupted, and its military reliant on those once labeled outsiders. The center no longer held. The story would continue with more emperors, more betrayals, and the final symbolic fall. But for now, the sackings, invasions, and shifting tides marked the beginning of the end for what had once been the greatest power the ancient world had known. By the mid-5th century, the once mighty Western Roman Empire had been reduced to a fragile patchwork of provinces barely held together by name alone. Its emperors were often figureheads, puppets of more powerful generals or foreign kings. The authority that once radiated from Rome now flickered weakly from Ravenna, a swampy city in northern Italy that had become the imperial capital since the early 400s, chosen not for its grandeur, but for its defensibility. In this crumbling world, the last emperor of the West would bear a name that echoed Rome's legendary beginning: Romulus. His full name, Romulus Augustulus, carried a weight that history would treat with both irony and melancholy. Romulus, like the mythical founder of Rome, and Augustulus, meaning Little Augustus, a diminutive of the title borne by the empire's first true emperor. A name heavy with imperial symbolism for a child king presiding over the final breath of an era. Romulus Augustulus was likely no older than 16 when he ascended the throne in 475 CE, placed there by his father Orestes, a Roman general of barbarian origin who had seized power in a coup. Orestes had previously served under Attila the Hun and was a skilled manipulator of both military and political forces. But even his control was short-lived. The empire's foreign mercenaries, many of them Herulians, Syrians, and Rugians, demanded land in Italy as payment for their service. Orestes refused. In response, the mercenaries rallied behind a chieftain named Odoacer. In 476 CE, Odoacer marched on Ravenna, defeated and executed Orestes, and deposed Romulus Augustulus. Remarkably, the young emperor's life was spared. Odoacer, perhaps out of respect or political pragmatism, sent him into quiet retirement, granting him a pension and a villa near Naples. With that symbolic act, the deposition of a boy emperor by a Germanic general, the Western Roman Empire, as a political entity, ceased to exist. Odoacer did not declare himself emperor. Instead, he ruled Italy as king of the Heruli, acknowledging the theoretical authority of the Eastern Roman Emperor in Constantinople. Yet, in practice, he governed independently. His rule marked the beginning of the post-Roman kingdoms in the West, regimes that retained Roman institutions and legal traditions but were led by non-Roman leaders and driven by new cultural currents. The year 476 CE has traditionally been marked as the fall of the Western Roman Empire, though the truth is more subtle. The transformation had been gradual, not sudden. Rome had not been conquered in the classic sense, but rather hollowed out from within and restructured by necessity. The Roman Senate still existed for a time. Roman law continued to shape policy. Latin remained the language of administration and culture, but imperial power no longer emanated from a Caesar in the West. It had shifted eastward, and eastward it would remain. For while the West was unraveling, the Eastern Roman Empire, known later as the Byzantine Empire, endured. With its capital in Constantinople, founded by Constantine the Great in 330 CE, the East had weathered the 5th century storms far better than its sister in the West. Geographically, it was more defensible, surrounded by seas and natural barriers. Economically, it remained vibrant, with flourishing cities, established trade routes, and stronger agricultural bases in Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt. And politically, it had more stable institutions and leaders who could command loyalty and levy resources when needed. Throughout the tumult in the West, the Eastern emperors had watched with both anxiety and detachment. They sent support when feasible, but often found themselves too embroiled in their own threats. Persian wars, theological disputes, and internal palace intrigues, to intervene decisively. Still, in theory, they never relinquished their claim to the Western territories. The Emperor Zeno, ruling in Constantinople at the time of Romulus Augustulus's fall, received Odoacer's submission with a mix of caution and diplomacy. Over the next centuries, the Eastern Empire would rise to dazzling heights under emperors like Justinian I, who in the 6th century would briefly reconquer parts of the lost Western lands, including Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain. Constantinople would become the beacon of classical civilization, preserving Roman law, Greek philosophy, Christian theology, and Eastern traditions in a unique synthesis. The city itself, with its golden domes and marble colonnades, would stand as a jewel of empire for 1,000 years more. Meanwhile, in the West, Rome's legacy took root in new soil. The successor kingdoms, Visigothic Spain, Ostrogothic Italy, Frankish Gaul, built their own structures atop Roman foundations. The Latin language evolved into Romance dialects. Roman roads continued to shape medieval trade, and Roman law echoed through the halls of future legal codes. Thus, while 476 CE may signal the fall of the Western Roman Empire, it is perhaps more accurate to view it as a transition. The empire did not vanish. It fragmented, adapted, and re-emerged in new forms. Its ghost would haunt the Middle Ages, inspire the Holy Roman Empire, and guide the thinkers of the Renaissance. Rome fell, but its ideas, its institutions, and its dreams endured. And in the East, behind the great walls of Constantinople, Rome lived on for nearly another millennium. As the dust of the Western Roman Empire's collapse settled and the Eastern Empire carried on from Constantinople, something extraordinary began to take shape. A phenomenon far more enduring than the political might of legions or emperors. Rome, though fallen as a state, continued to live on as a set of ideas. Its influence extended into the very fabric of civilization, quietly embedding itself in law, language, government, and culture. It was no longer merely an empire of land and army. It had become an empire of memory. One of the most powerful and long-lasting inheritances of Rome was its legal tradition. Roman law, developed over centuries, was not just a series of commands or decrees, but a carefully structured body of principles rooted in reason and equity. The Roman jurists, thinkers like Ulpian, Gaius, and Papinian, elevated legal discussion into a disciplined field of inquiry. These were not merely administrators or judges, they were philosophers of justice. At the heart of Roman law stood the concept of jus, or legal right, a term that reflected both social obligations and natural principles. From the 12 tables of the early Republic to the sprawling Corpus Juris Civilis compiled under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, Roman law laid out detailed protections for property, contracts, family matters, and criminal behavior. But it also included a set of ideals: that laws must be knowable, that punishment must fit the crime, that no one, not even the emperor, should be above the law. It was this rational and systematized approach that made Roman law so adaptable and appealing long after the empire's borders had vanished. In the Middle Ages, rediscovery of Justinian's legal code in Italian monasteries would spark the revival of legal studies in Europe, eventually giving rise to universities like Bologna and Paris. By the time of the Enlightenment, thinkers from John Locke to Montesquieu were citing Roman principles to justify ideas of constitutionalism, separation of powers, and checks on tyranny. In many modern countries, especially those with civil law systems, echoes of Roman law remain embedded in statutes and judicial reasoning. Nations like France, Spain, Italy, Germany, and many others across Latin America owe much of their legal DNA to the Roman Code. Even in common law systems like England and the United States, where precedent takes precedence over codified systems, Roman legal thought provides foundational ideas such as habeas corpus, the presumption of innocence, and due process. But if Roman law shaped how societies would govern themselves, Latin, Rome's spoken and written language, shaped how they would communicate. Latin was more than the administrative tongue of the empire. It became the intellectual and spiritual language of the West. For nearly 2 millennia, from the time of Cicero to the age of Newton, Latin remained the language of diplomacy, philosophy, medicine, science, and theology. Though Latin eventually fell out of everyday speech, it did not disappear. Instead, it transformed. As the Western Empire fragmented and local dialects took root in Gaul, Iberia, and the Italian peninsula, Latin gave birth to a family of new languages, the Romance languages. These languages, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, retained much of the vocabulary and structure of their parent tongue, but evolved with regional flavor, influenced by local customs, migrations, and new political realities. Consider the word for mother. Mater in Latin becomes madre in Spanish, mère in French, madre again in Italian, and mama in Romanian. The continuity is unmistakable. Even in English, a Germanic language, the Roman imprint is profound. Through centuries of Latin-infused legal, religious, and scholarly vocabulary, nearly 60% of English words trace back to Latin origins. Words like justice, liberty, nation, empire, capital, forum, and culture all descend from Rome's linguistic legacy. Latin also maintained a central role in the Catholic Church, where it was the liturgical and scholarly language for over 1,000 years. For popes, theologians, and priests, Latin was the medium of doctrine and discourse. It remains the official language of the Vatican to this day. This language of empire, once spoken by soldiers and senators, continued to shape poetry, law, science, and religion long after the empire that birthed it had fallen silent. From the speeches of Cicero to the writings of Augustine, from Gregorian chants in Romanesque cathedrals to Newton's Principia Mathematica, Latin endured as the voice of inquiry, discipline, and universal aspiration. Thus, in both its law and its language, Rome forged legacies that proved stronger than borders and longer lived than dynasties. The grandeur of its cities and the splendor of its armies faded, but its voice and its rules endured. And they still speak to us now, across time and place, in the words we use, the rights we claim, and the laws by which we live. As twilight fell over the Roman Empire, its structures, both physical and philosophical, continued to cast long shadows across the world. The grandeur of its cities, the precision of its aqueducts, and the subtle force of its political ideas remain embedded in how we build, move, govern, and define ourselves today. The legacy of Rome is not just written in books, but etched into stone, echoed in concrete domes, and walked upon in cobbled roads that still lie beneath modern streets. Rome was a civilization of engineers, as much as it was a civilization of warriors and senators. Its people understood the land not merely as territory to be conquered, but as something to be shaped, sustained, and connected. Roman architecture and engineering were not luxuries, they were acts of statecraft, tools of administration, and instruments of imperial unity. Perhaps the most iconic symbol of Roman ingenuity is the aqueduct. These silent stone arteries transported fresh water from mountain springs to cities across the empire, some traveling dozens of miles with barely a perceptible slope. The Aqua Claudia, the Aqua Marcia, these were marvels of calculation and labor. They made possible the public baths, fountains, and sanitation systems that defined Roman urban life, and their remnants still stand today, quiet and noble reminders of Rome's practical genius. Equally enduring are the roads, thousands of miles of carefully laid stone stretching from the heart of Rome to the most distant frontier. All roads lead to Rome, the saying goes, and once they truly did. Built in layers with drainage systems and mile markers, Roman roads were more than infrastructure. They were arteries of empire, allowing legions, messages, and merchants to move with unparalleled speed across the vast dominion. Many modern highways in Europe and the Middle East trace the very same routes laid out by Roman engineers over 2,000 years ago. And then there are the buildings, the temples, forums, amphitheatres, and basilicas, constructed not only with grandeur in mind, but also functionality and symmetry. The Romans borrowed from the Greeks, yes, but they transformed those ideals into something sturdier and more expansive. The use of concrete allowed for daring feats of construction, like the Pantheon with its perfectly spherical dome and oculus open to the sky. Its proportions are still studied by architects today. Public life was lived in forums, where politics, commerce, and conversation intertwined. Spectacles took place in amphitheatres like the Colosseum, where citizens gathered not just for entertainment, but to experience a shared civic identity. Justice was dispensed in basilicas, ancestors of the modern courthouse. The architectural grammar of arches, domes, vaults, and colonnades, pioneered by the Romans, lives on in buildings around the world, from Washington, D.C. to Paris, from Istanbul to London. But beyond stone and mortar, perhaps Rome's most elusive yet profound legacy lies in its idea of citizenship. In a world that once knew only subjects and slaves, Rome offered a radical notion that one could belong to a state not simply by birthright or bloodline, but through allegiance, service, and law. The Roman citizen was both protected by and bound to the republic or empire. Citizenship meant access to legal rights, to participation in governance, at least for a time, and to a sense of shared identity that extended across vast cultural and linguistic divides. This concept of civic identity became a powerful tool for unification. People from Hispania, Gaul, Syria, and North Africa could become Roman in law and often in culture. It was not perfect. Hierarchies remained, and citizenship was extended selectively. But the ideal endured, that an empire could be built not only by conquest, but also by integration. The Emperor Caracalla's edict in 212 CE, which granted Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire, was a watershed moment in the history of inclusion. It foreshadowed modern ideas of national citizenship, where identity transcends ethnicity and hinges on legal equality. This Roman idea of empire, not merely as a collection of territories, but as a cultural and legal framework, has shaped the ambitions of states ever since. From the Holy Roman Empire to Napoleonic France, from British imperialism to the European Union, echoes of Rome persist. Even today, many political thinkers draw upon Roman concepts of governance, rights, and cosmopolitanism to imagine a more interconnected world. Rome's notion of identity, complex, layered, and evolving, still challenges us. Who belongs? Who is protected? Who has a voice? These are Roman questions, still unanswered in many places, and yet they continue to guide the architecture of modern democracies, the rhetoric of human rights, and the dreams of unity across borders. So, when we walk beneath a vaulted dome, cast a vote, claim citizenship, or travel along a road that cuts straight across the land, we walk not just in the present, but also in the memory of Rome. The empire may have fallen, but its footprints remain beneath our feet, its thoughts echo in our institutions, and its spirit whispers in the very stones that outlived it.